Thanks, Ray. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for having us out here. I'm glad you guys came, for all of you that came out here. This is my first event since February of 2019, so I'm extremely happy to see a lot of people in person and not virtually on a monitor or a screen or looking into a camera, you know, in my pajama bottoms and t-shirt. But, you know, interestingly enough, this event, you know, marks what should have been the 5th year of this, and I believe that we had Shawn scheduled for last year, and I'm glad he could make it again this year. But being that we've had, you know, this is our 4th event, it seems like every year Ray does better and better, and this time you got an extra year of planning to do it. And I'm really looking forward to having the sessions with you guys and all, and Altronics is very happy to be a sponsor, and every year this event gets better, and I can't wait, you know, to continue to do it in the next years. So I want to introduce to you guys Shawn Henry, the CSO president of CrowdStrike. Henry has a pretty interesting resume. Retired from the FBI, he leads a team of world-class cybersecurity experts mitigating corporate and government threats around the world. And I've seen his commercials on TV. I've seen some of his interviews with, you know, different organizations all the way from Australia to the US. And being what they do as far as cybersecurity threats, it's one of the topics that we've discussed here year after year, and it seems like it's taking over more and more of the industry as far as what we are doing as companies to mitigate our own threats and our own products. So Shawn is here today, and he's going to give us the state of the cybersecurity landscape, and he's also going to hopefully tell us some really good stories of some real world things that have happened, and we can have a better understanding of what we need to do as consultants, manufacturers, integrators that are all here today to keep our customers safe from the threats around the world. So without further ado, Mr. Shawn Henry.
Thank you, Ronnie. I appreciate it. I'm glad you were wearing pajama bottoms. Thank you. Ray had 2 years to get a speaker, and he went with the same guy. So I'm not really sure exactly what that means, but I'm happy to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to be a consult with this group of security professionals. This is my first time on a stage since 2020, February, so it's been about 20 months. So we'll shake off the rust. I speak pretty regularly in venues around the world. But talking to folks who are in the security business is really important to me, folks that have experience in this space. As Ronnie said, I spent 24 years in the FBI before I came to CrowdStrike, and in that capacity, I ran half the Bureau's operations globally. Criminal investigations, cyber investigations, international operations, critical incident response, and I've been at CrowdStrike now focused primarily on cybersecurity for the last 10 years, so about 33, 34 years of security. What I want to talk about today is a whole host of things. I'll start with talking about the agenda, the threat, the cyber threat landscape. What are we seeing specifically in cyber in terms of emerging technologies, adversaries' tactics, some of the, kind of get into the mindset of who the adversaries are and what they're doing. I'll give you some examples, a couple stories about what we're seeing, and really kind of drill in, though, primarily to some of this thought leadership, helping you better understand not just cybersecurity specifically, but the security landscape more broadly. How can you deal with your customers, your clients, maybe your leadership in your organization. What are the types of things that they should be thinking about? So this is not going to be a technical discussion about the ones and zeros specifically, but really talking, kind of creating a framework to help people understand the cyber threat specifically, and then more generally just security overall for folks that are in the business. One of the key pieces of that for me is crisis response, and when there is an actual incident, some type of an issue, how do you handle it? How do you deal with it? What are the, again, kind of big issues you should be thinking about, ensuring that you've got the right capabilities and the capacity to respond to those issues when they occur. And I'm saving some time here towards the end for Q&A. I always am interested in hearing what people in the audience are thinking about, anything specific that you want to drill into, anything I might have said, or any other questions about anything at all. So from a security perspective, it all starts with risk, and particularly cybersecurity. I deal with a lot of boards of directors. I deal with the C-suite in many organizations, and I'm constantly, they ask me to come in and talk to them about cybersecurity, and it always starts with this. Because in many of these situations, these folks that are in leadership positions, maybe they're investors, they're providing oversight as a director of a board, C-suite executives who don't have an understanding about cyber, and I tell them, forget the ones and zeros, this is not technical, you don't need to be technical to understand this. When you're making decisions, it starts with risk. And I think that more broadly with security, it's always about risk. Everything, as we prioritize things, as we're making key decisions, as we're looking where to invest resources, it all comes down to risk. And the risk begins with the threat. Where's the danger? What does the risk actually mean? So I'm going to focus on risk a lot as we go through this. Everything that I talk about really ties back to risk. When I talk to boards, I tell them this is a business risk. It's no different than you're thinking about relocating to a new geo, or you're looking at introducing a new product line, or discontinuing a product line, or you're doing an acquisition. It's a business risk, and that you need to start to evaluate this as a business risk. So when I think about risk as it relates to cyber, there are three ways that I help to kind of frame that for me, but especially in talking to folks, there are a lot more variables to risk than three. Lots of different variables, but the three that I use are threat times vulnerability times consequences. And it's times, not plus, because if you can actually get any one of these things to zero, then the risk becomes zero. If you eliminate all threats, it doesn't matter what the vulnerabilities are, and there aren't going to be any impacts. If there's no impact at all, it doesn't matter what the threats or the vulnerabilities are. You're never going to get all of these things to zero. It's never going to happen. So how do you manage that? How do you work through that? How do you work through the calculus? So when we're talking about cyber, we'll start with the threat actors. Who are the actors? There is a human being on the other end of every single cyber attack. We're not yet at the point, although we'll probably get there in good time, where computers are targeting computers. We are at the point where there has to be a human being involved. Okay, and that's actually really important from a security perspective, because when you introduce human beings into the equation, there's a lot of different ways to address this, right? If you're talking about machines, there's certain ways to handle it, but with human beings involved, it provides a lot more latitude and flexibility, I think, from a security perspective. I'll talk about each of these organizations in some detail. But it's important to understand that each of these actors have different motivations, they have different capabilities, they have different capacity, and depending on which of these entities are targeting you. It's going to change, in many cases, the response. It's not going to be a complete change, but there are certain variables that are going to factor into what your defensive posture looks like and what your response might look like if you're facing an actual attack. So we'll start with nation states. There are dozens of nations that have capabilities and are using the cyber vector as an attack strategy. It's part of their playbook. It's an arrow in their quiver, and that's increasing as we continue. More and more nation states that are taking on capabilities. The big four are North Korea, Iran, Russia, China, targeting the US and the West. Nation states historically used the networks for espionage. When I started doing cybersecurity with the FBI back in the late 1990s, it really was about electronic espionage, targeting countries to collect intelligence specifically about what their military doctrine looked like, what their economic strategies looked like, what their diplomatic actions might be, looking at the defense industrial base, targeting them to look at the evolution of weaponry, etc. We moved into the theft of intellectual property, corporate strategies, organizations, nation states that are targeting companies specifically to collect their R&D, their intellectual property, so that they can take that technology, they can move it to their countries in their home nation, and then manufacture the same type of equipment for pennies on the dollar. They're not doing the R&D, they're not doing the testing and the validation. Everything's been laid out, they've got all the schematics, and they're able to just go right to production. And we see this over and over and over again across manufacturing. We've seen it in pharmaceutical. We've seen it corporate strategies being taken from financial services sector, et cetera. There's a lot more devious activity that goes beyond that. As we've moved forward, I'll talk a bit about how this is becoming more militarily focused and some of the attack strategies that are being utilized. When I'm talking about nation states, in the overwhelming majority of these situations, we are talking about military entities within the nation that are focused 100% of their time. They've got clear collection requirements, just like the intelligence community does. They're targeting clear strategies that they've been designated. And they've got essentially unlimited resources and unlimited time. And what we've got defending against these people are civilians who are trying to defend themselves against heavily armed military organizations. Organized crime groups that are focused primarily on the financial services sector, historically, the retail sector, historically, they've been focused on collecting intelligence that they can monetize, so theft of credit card numbers and retail information, bank information for fraudulent ACH transfers, those sorts of things. These organizations have migrated towards much more deviant types of activity where they're still focused from a financial perspective, but they've changed their tactics a bit. Ransomware, which I'll talk about in some detail in a couple of minutes, but they're moving towards the capability that will provide them the biggest return on their investment. These groups, in many cases, the actors have never met each other in person. They've aggregated online, they've collaborated online, they've got specific individuals that have very clear areas of expertise, somebody who's able to develop a phishing email, somebody who works on crafting the malware, somebody who does the reconnaissance to identify the high-value targets, somebody who, once data is taken, they can then monetize it, transfer it to cash somewhere, whether through cryptocurrency or movements through different banks. They're engaged in money laundering. These organizations, their capabilities are just below nation state. They've got a high level of capability. And they are incredibly well funded because of all the revenue that they've been able to generate over the years. Primarily operating out of the former Soviet Union, but not necessarily. We've seen groups emerging through the Americas, north and south, throughout Asia, and the Middle East as well. And I'll talk a bit about these groups in a couple minutes. And then there are hacktivist groups and terrorist groups. Legitimate terrorist groups, and when I say terrorist groups, individuals that are associated with groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Al-Shabaab, traditional, what I call bomb throwers, people that are engaged in the kinetic world, that have looked to promote their political ideology through the use of physical attacks, and now have started to migrate towards the network, where they realize they can have the same impact on critical infrastructure through the use of a cyber-enabled or digital attack as they have in the physical world and the kinetic world. Hacktivist groups are groups that are using the network to promote their social or political agenda. And we've seen a lot more attacks like this, typically targeting the government, where the individuals are not happy with government policies or strategies, so they target the government to get their cause out there. We've seen CEOs of companies targeted specifically. There was a company just in the last couple of weeks, they're involved in the healthcare field. They were targeted by anti-vaxxers who felt that they weren't sending the right message out. Personally, individuals in the organization, as well as family members within the organization, targeted through social media, doxing them, taking their personal information, their address, putting it out publicly online, people physically showing up at these people's homes. So just the network being used to collect intelligence, to disseminate intelligence, and then to cause some type of physical action. And then the insider, which is a critical piece for all of us when we're talking about security. Because the insiders have the closest access, they've got best understanding of how the environment works and operates, they have key understanding of the underbelly of the organization, where the organization might be most vulnerable, they have an understanding about what is going to happen in the future, corporate strategies, and where they might be able to have a significant impact on the company. So do we have disgruntled employees? Do you have folks in the organization that have some type of problems? Maybe they've got a gambling problem, a drug problem, they're looking to make money. Organizations where we've seen recently, and this actually is really kind of a derivative, I think, of work from home, where employees are working from home and they've got 2 full-time jobs. And they're, in many cases, and I've talked to a number of CISOs about this as recently as last week, working for direct competitors, where they've actually got 2 laptops set up at home, and they're returning email back and forth between 2 laptops, and they've got visibility into what's happening in both organizations. So it certainly poses a significant threat. People that are leaving for a competitor, so maybe they're good employees, but as they're leaving, they decide, you know, I've been working on these projects over the last few years, they're mine. And off they go. Corporate strategies, corporate roadmap, customer lists, those sorts of things certainly poses a threat to the organization. And it's something that needs to be you need to be aware of. And then specifically targeting you, specifically targeting the organization, where they're actually brought into or gain access to the organization, apply for positions within the organization with a specific intent to impact the organization. And that's where we have these blurred lines, where we've actually seen nation states co-opt individuals who are already employed in a company through threats, through coercion, financial remuneration, to get them to provide information outside. There was, the FBI actually put something out publicly about 2 years ago now, but this is continuing to occur, where nation states within Silicon Valley were targeting individuals in high-tech corporations. So sitting outside coffee shops where they know everybody goes over to that particular coffee shop, Monday through Friday, between 7 and 9, and sitting inside, listening to people, and then identifying people that they might look to target. Hiring individuals after they've been co-opted, so identifying those individuals that might be susceptible, where they've got a personal vulnerability, like gambling or a drug addiction or something. There was you likely saw this story about 6 months ago, where a Russian national, unclear if they were working on behalf of the Russian government or not, or Russian organized crime, but offered an employee at Tesla $1 million to put a USB device into the organization's network. So here, take this, and we'll pay you $1 million after we gain access. That was public, it was announced. There are lots of other stories similar to this, but there's this blurred lines. We've also seen organized crime groups in nation states. I mentioned earlier about these organized crime groups, their capabilities that are increasing, where we've seen traditional nation state tools or tactics that are being appropriated by organized crime groups. And there's lots of speculation in the intelligence community about how or why that's happening. People that are just retiring, one day they're working in the military, and the next day they're working for this organized crime group, and they happen to take things with them, the infrastructure or capabilities. We've seen situations where nation states have identified some very, very highly capable individuals that are working for organized crime groups, and they, hey, we're going to arrest you unless you want to work for us. So there's this kind of this melding of these two components. So there are blurred lines, and it's very challenging sometimes from a law enforcement perspective, from an intel community perspective, to try and sort out who's who. And I'll talk about why it's important for us to do that. These organizations are operating 24/7, 365 days a year. And most often we see Friday afternoon around 5 o'clock and through the weekend on holidays where attacks are happening here in the US, because the adversaries know people are getting ready to go on vacation, they've got a weekend planned. Those are areas or times when organizations are highly vulnerable, when people are stepping away from the computer or they've got something else that's occupying their time. So from a security perspective, it makes it much more challenging for all of us. How do we make sure we're in a position to respond to these incidents? How do we make sure that we've got the capability to identify these incidents? So a whole host of things we need to be thinking about as it relates to that. So talking about the threat actors, let me talk a bit about the vulnerabilities. There's this whole concept of the target space that is getting bigger and bigger, more interconnected, which makes things, which introduces more vulnerabilities or allows more vulnerabilities to be accessed by the threat actors. And when you've got point and click capabilities now, and those that are not necessarily skilled, that can target organizations, the individuals that have some nefarious intent, they don't necessarily have the technical skills. For a defender, it should be something relatively easy. I'm talking about commodity type software or malware. It should be relatively easy for defenders to protect against, but it's just more noise in the environment. And I can tell you, as a defender of networks, security practitioners have become overwhelmed sometimes with too much noise. And how do you separate out what's important from what's really just kind of superfluous and not a significant threat? But that fatigue threatens security professionals when you're constantly on high alert, even for things that might be low level. So how do you defend against that? And that is created vulnerability. So I'm not going to talk about specific pieces of malware. I want to talk about some of the advances or the movements in the networks that are increasing these vulnerabilities and making things more challenging for us. So the complexity, I think, in the enterprise, this concept of this ever-expanding target space, right? So every single environment is almost like a living, breathing organism, right? Somebody left the company yesterday, they've got a device in the environment that might be now unmanaged, no one's paying attention to, new people are coming into the environment, there are new technologies that are being introduced. When I started doing this back in the late 90s, we were focused specifically on LANs and WANs, right? Connected networks, and then the movement towards wireless devices and mobile devices, and now the cloud, this constant expansion of technology, which is changing the dynamic, and it's becoming increasingly complex. And again, when you think about the fatigue of defenders to protect against the different adversaries that are targeting different aspects of the environment, and now this increased complexity, how do you manage the assets in your environment? It becomes a significant challenge. IoT, for me, I think one of the most understated concerns. I know there are a lot of folks here that are in the space. Billions and billions of devices that heretofore were not IP addressable but are now connected to the network. And again, kind of that expansion of the network. I am a huge believer in embracing technology and not running away from it. I think it's made our lives incredibly more enjoyable and easier. The internet itself is probably the greatest advancement certainly in my lifetime. And we need to embrace it, but we've got to be thinking about some of the security concerns as we introduce new devices. Billions of devices, commercial applications, dishwashers, refrigerators, HVAC, cars, planes, audio equipment, cameras, all sorts of things that are now connected. Oftentimes, security is not foremost, it's not front and center, it's sometimes an afterthought if it's a thought. And every device that's connected to the environment is a potential ingress into the enterprise. And we're seeing now more and more devices with vulnerabilities that are being targeted. So Shodan, you've likely heard of Google for IoT, where actors can search for every single connected device on the internet by manufacturer name. So when there's a vulnerability that's released, they can actually search for all vulnerable instances of that particular device, and they can find oftentimes the geolocation of that particular device, and is providing them with much greater capability to provide that access. And then OT, information technology, operational technology, we're seeing adversaries that are exploiting the gap between those two entities. Where OT historically has been air-gapped in many cases, but now there's a lot more connectivity between the two environments. IT running the admin portion, OT running the operational portion of the organization, IT folks concerned about privacy and the loss of data, OT folks focused on safety, oftentimes working independently, not coordinating or collaborating, and adversaries exploiting that gap. We've also seen OT significantly impacted by things like ransomware. Not necessarily because the OT environment itself was compromised, because in many cases they're running legacy operating systems that adversaries don't even necessarily have capabilities to exploit or aren't focused on exploiting, but because the IT environment is down, there's some level of connectivity, or IT controls the people that are focused on OT, or in some cases the OT is shut down because of an abundance of caution, the IT environment's breached, therefore we're concerned about what might happen. Again, safety issues, is there some vulnerability in our OT environment, or is it going to be impacted, so it's shut down? So regardless of whether it's targeted or not, it's actually impacted. So that's created some significant challenges for organizations. And the supply chain, which you've heard a lot about. I'm not talking about are you going to be able to get your gifts for the holidays, although that's probably a component of this, but specifically how adversaries are targeting the supply chain in order to get greater access to broader organizations. So you likely have heard about SolarWinds, a security company that provides network monitoring software that was compromised. The build environment of their software was targeted by an adversary that was able to inject malware into their software. When their software was pushed or downloaded, when companies upgraded to their software, they unknowingly, unwittingly ingested that malware into their environment, which provided remote access into their environment by the adversaries. Kaseya, similar organization that provides software to manage security service organizations, where an adversary was able to exploit a vulnerability and to put a payload that was able to distribute ransomware to their customers, so that their customers executed ransomware in their environment. Thousands of customers for each of these breaches. But when you think about the advancing methodologies by the adversaries, they can target every single one of your organizations individually, right? And there are 200 people in the room. That's 200 levels of effort. Or they can target the one supplier that is supplying all of your organizations at one time, focus all their efforts there, and then get access to 60% of the organization. So you can see how they're changing their methodologies based on this expansion of the target space. But everybody you're doing business with, all of your customers, your contractors, your subcontractors, if you're doing an acquisition, we've seen, there was a nation state about a year and a half ago that targeted a particular company that was being bid on by a number of major organizations because this was actually a critical player in their supply chain, and they knew that company was going to be acquired by one of these 4 or 5 organizations. So they targeted that organization specifically, and after the acquisition was done, they had access to the parent, the now parent company. So supply chain is a huge, huge issue. Everybody you're connected to, you've got to be concerned about. Can't just focus just on your organization, but everybody else. And then the concerns about how do you protect the production environment from a software perspective? How do you ensure the integrity of the data? Because if that's compromised and then it's distributed very broadly, it creates a havoc. Third-party risk, just kind of building upon the supply chain piece. How many third parties have access to your network? How many of them have been screened? What type of effort has been conducted to ensure the integrity? And there are a lot of organizations now, contractually, when they're doing business with certain manufacturers or certain suppliers, they're asking for attestation. Show me what your cybersecurity program looks like. We want to actually let a third party do a penetration test of your environment to ensure that that you've got that level of integrity. And then how often is that done? Is it done annually? Is it done biannually? Is it done every 5 years? How often do you do it? Because of course you can test positive today and be negative tomorrow. That was a little COVID joke. Something that I think is critically important is this intersection of the digital space and the physical space. In many organizations, you've got physical security, you've got information security, and those two entities operate separately. But I am a big believer in thinking about this holistically, and the adversaries that are likely to target you are going to use, or certainly can use, multiple vectors to get to you. So I've already talked about clear examples of nation states and organized crime groups that have used human beings, accessing human beings to gain access. We know, you've heard, I'm sure, 2 decades ago about dumpster diving, right? People going in, pulling out old hardware, looking for critical information on that hardware, or looking for usernames and passwords, etc. But we see the physical space still. You know, you can put together the greatest information security program in the world, and if you leave the back door to your server room unlocked, that creates a problem. I know there are folks that work on securing data centers, and the physical access piece is critically important. I also think that there are a lot more similarities than there are differences in physical and information security. And I actually, when I'm talking to folks who don't have any technical background, I use a lot of physical analogies because I think they resonate with folks. So a lot of the theories, the principles behind cybersecurity are really based on what we've been doing in the physical world for many, many decades, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So just some quick tips. You are a target. If you don't think that you're a target, then you shouldn't be in security. I've had people tell me, we don't have anything of value, nobody would target us. And my first question is always, have you told your shareholders you don't have anything of value? Because somebody is actually collecting revenue inside your company. I imagine they're buying it for a purpose, right? So there's something there. The concept of them coming together, and these are two things I've just talked about. But I always say it's all hazards. When we talk about continuity of operations and business resiliency, it even goes beyond the physical threat actors, right? When you talk about all hazards from security, it might be the threat from a hurricane, a flood, a tornado, an earthquake, and lots of security organizations are focused on the totality of that. I think when you're thinking about what your continuity of operations program looks like, it is all hazards. It doesn't matter if the company's down and out because you were targeted by an organized crime group or because an earthquake took down your data center and you can't communicate with anybody. And taking advantage of the crisis. Remember, there's a human being at the other end that are constantly changing their tactics, and they're doing it based on what's happening in the world. So we saw during COVID organizations that went to a complete remote workforce overnight. So many companies have had this digital transformation, movement to the cloud, and they're looking at moving over the course of 3 to 5 years. COVID hit, all the employees scatter to their home office, and now instead of 3 to 5 years, it's 3 to 5 weeks, or in some cases 3 to 5 days. You've got to transform. Adversaries recognize that and understood that. Employees are off the corporate security stack. Adversaries are focused on where people are located, what type of equipment are they using. They're not updating. They're working on insecure routers. They're not patching their systems. And we saw lots of employees targeted. We also saw adversaries using new phishing schemes that were focused on the crisis. So sending out emails to people, to individuals, spraying them, saying, the latest COVID statistics, or, here's a new strain, or here's where you can go to get your stimulus payment. So they're adopting real-world events to get access to individuals. So when we talk about the impact, I am not going to spend time on this, but important to know there's lots of fraud and e-crime, whether it be these ACH transfers, etc. When I started doing cybersecurity, this was the big issue. But we've moved way beyond that. We've moved beyond the theft of personally identifiable information and personal health records. That is still important. And if you're working for an organization and you're securing the organization, they're going to be interested in that. So I'm certainly not minimizing it or marginalizing it, but it's important to understand from a priorities perspective. When I think about impact on an organization, so we talked about threats, talked about vulnerabilities, the consequence piece. What we've seen here recently is significant in terms of consequences. I mentioned SolarWinds and Kaseya already, JBS, Colonial Pipeline. This is where I see boards of directors and the C-suite starting to pay attention. It's unfortunate that it took some of these catastrophic attacks to get their attention, because we've been talking about this for more than 20 years. But all of a sudden, when somebody steals 250,000 credit card numbers, it doesn't get a lot of headlines. But now when you see people standing online 40 minutes for gas, which we haven't seen since the 1970s. Now it's got people's attention. The media is picking up on it. You know, we can't buy hamburgers for the 4th of July celebration. Oh my God, we got to do something about this. So I'm glad that that attention has gotten people's attention to get them to start to focus on security, but it goes well beyond this. And there's lots of, I won't read through all these, but these are headlines every single day, over and over and over again now, particularly through ransomware, what we're seeing. But it is literally the tip of the iceberg, because we've just seen this significant uptick, a hockey stick, in the level and frequency of attacks, and it is absolutely, there are hundreds of attacks for every one of these that you read about. There are hundreds of other attacks that are unreported for a variety of reasons. So, this is the ransomware piece that's really gotten people's attention. Again, consequences. This is the variable that I think that really factors in most right now to when we think about cybersecurity. What is the impact to the organization? Ransomware, adversaries deploying malware that encrypts all your data in your environment, and if you want to get it back, you've got to pay to get it back. We've seen this increase in about more than 80% of the investigations that we responded to over the last year had some ransomware component. Adversaries have caught on to the way organizations are trying to overcome ransomware. So, you know, there's this best practice about backing up your data, which you should absolutely do, right? You've got to back up your data, where adversaries have launched an email, your files are encrypted, pay us money through cryptocurrency, and the CISO or some executive in the company says, ha, we're not paying you because we just restored everything from backups. That's great. But the adversary was in the environment 6 weeks earlier and actually stole all your stuff. So now, when you say ha-ha, they say ha-ha. We're actually disseminating all your stuff to your customers. We're putting it out on the dark web. We're going public with it. So you've been breached. You've got mandatory reporting requirements. You've got to go through the whole process. So you might as well just pay us. And we can talk about ransomware in great detail, about what the concepts are, do you pay or not, how likely is it that something's going to actually happen, is the adversary going to come back and target you again if you pay, how easy is it to restore from backups? I can tell you that if you do get the decryption keys, it doesn't mean they're going to work. And it doesn't mean, you know, it's not like you pay the ransom and then you flip a switch and now everything's back up and running. It can take weeks, many weeks, to actually restore the environment, and in many cases it's just partially restored. So trying to recover from one of these attacks is bad. I'm going to go through I do want to talk about the destructiveware piece because that's important. Ransomware, encryption of data, the access to your data is lost. Destructiveware, where the malware actually corrupts the boot sector or firmware or has some impact in the environment so that the hardware itself is unrecoverable. You can't load software onto the hardware. So that requires not just the rebuilding of the databases of the software, but actually physically bringing in new hardware and building the infrastructure, which adds weeks or months onto this whole recovery process. Three nation states have launched destructiveware inside the United States against the US commercial sector. Think about that. If a nation state dropped a bomb on the headquarters of a company, that would have I think, a pretty significant response. But they have dropped virtual bombs inside US corporations and physically disrupted those organizations for months, costing billions of dollars and many months worth of lost operations. Can't communicate with your customers, can't build your products, can't collect revenue, can't bill. Significant challenge. All right, a couple of myths here. It's impossible to do attribution. It's not impossible, it's certainly a challenge. Understanding who the adversaries are is really important as a security professional. It's important to understand who's targeting me. If I told you that somebody was going to show up at your house tonight at 11 o'clock at night, your first question would be who? Who's showing up? Is it my neighbors coming by for a drink or to watch a movie? Probably not 11 o'clock, that's another story. Or is it a trained assassin, right? That would matter to you. Who's targeting me? Why are they coming by? It's all about the money. There are all sorts of issues. We've talked about nation states looking for military information, IP, intellectual property theft, the ability to impact or influence people through hacktivists, etc. It's not all about the money. And the infrastructure, while important, and we've seen adversaries now targeting the infrastructure, targeting water systems, targeting electric power grid, etc. There's a much larger component to that. For years, people have been talking about information sharing. We need to share information. The government talks about public-private partnership. We need to share information, which is good. It's important, but it's not the be-all, end-all. And it's not about information. It's about intelligence, and it's about actionable intelligence, because information can be just a lot of noise. And I talked about this security fatigue by professionals. When you're starting to get all sorts of information, you can't sort it out, you don't know what's important or how to prioritize it, it's a bit of a challenge. There's no silver bullet. There's no silver bullet. Technology is a part of the solution, but there's policies and processes. There are strategies that involve how the network is segmented and how we respond to the network. But there's not going to be a particular technology that is going to stop all of these attacks. In an ideal world, we'd be able to keep the adversary out of the network, but that is never going to happen, and I'll talk about why that's not going to happen. I've talked about it already. The size of the network, you're not going to be able to stop every incident. But what can you do? It's not solvable, but it's manageable. There are things we can do to manage the environment, to manage our response, to help to mitigate some of these threats, but we're not going to eliminate the problem. And it's the reason it's not hopeless either, right? I said earlier, we're going to embrace technology. It's not going away. All of you are involved in technology. You're using it every day as a consumer, as part of your organization, part of your company. We've got to manage expectations for folks that it's not hopeless. So how do we prepare? Who said that? Anybody? Famous swimmer. Nice. Mark Spitz. Mark Spitz. All right. If you fail to prepare, you prepare to fail. I can tell you that the overwhelming majority of cyber breaches that we see are self-inflicted wounds, where there's a lot that could have been done on the front side that would have prevented the attack. So, do you understand where your assets are? I talked about this expansion. Do you know where the assets are in your environment? When somebody leaves, are we turning off their access? When there's a new vulnerability that's been released, are we patching it? Is there a protocol to get that done? Because I can tell you, when a new vulnerability is released, that day adversaries are trying to actively exploit it. And many companies are just not getting to it within a couple of months, couple weeks, couple months, sometimes never. So it's a self-inflicted wound. There's this key. I've talked about the totality of the response, a holistic response in an organization, both physical and personnel that focuses on this, but there's this whole concept of defense in depth. and ensuring that you've got multiple layers of defense. Again, same thing we've done in the physical world, right? You got the moat, and you've got the castle wall, and you've got the archers on top of the castle wall, or you've got your office complex, and you've got a gate outside, and you've got a fence, and then you've got a security guard who's checking IDs, you've got cameras, you've got remote access capability. You've got to be focused on the totality of this, and then you've got to test your system regularly, right? You play the way you practice. And if you're not constantly testing and evaluating, these are all the things to be doing in advance of an attack that if they're happening, and they're happening on a regular basis, they're going to make you much more resilient, they're going to make you much more capable of responding. The minute you get away from fundamentals, whether it's proper technique, work ethic, or mental preparation, the bottom can fall out of your game, your schoolwork, your job, whatever you're doing. Anybody? Michael Jordan. Preparation, preparing, constantly, muscle memory, right? Muscle memory, over and over again. You don't shoot free throws or three-pointers unless you're constantly doing it over and over again. It's the same exact concept in security. You're training, you're responding. I know we've got folks here from the military. It's inculcated, right? It's part of preparation. Now, you know this one. Baseball is the only endeavor where a man can succeed 3 times out of 10 and be considered a good performer. No, not Yogi Berra. Greatest hitter of all time. If you bat 300, you're going to the Hall of Fame. If you bat 300 in cybersecurity, you're going to prison. You're certainly going to the unemployment line. It's bad. Not the will that matters. Everyone has that. It's the will to prepare to win that matters. Bear Bryant, right? Again, this preparation is so critical from a security perspective. So how do we prepare for a crisis from an operational perspective? How do we do that? I already told you. Who are the adversaries that are going to target us? What are the vulnerabilities they're going to exploit? And what's it going to mean to our organization? Right? I've already talked about this. Who's going to target us? What are our biggest threats? How do we protect ourselves? What are our key resources, our key assets that might be targeted? Do we have a plan in place? Have we exercised it? Have we prepared for it? Do we have people in line that we've coordinated with, partners that are going to collaborate, outside counsel, security consultants? These are all the questions we need to be asking in advance of an actual incident. What's our recovery plan look like? It goes on and on and on. But these are the questions I talk to boards about, that here's some of the things you need to be thinking about. Certainly your CISO needs to be thinking about it. Your IT security team needs to be thinking about it. This is a dynamic. It changes every single day, and the security protocol you put in place today may have to change tomorrow, and that's okay. We need to be flexible, we need to be dynamic, we need to be changing and constantly aware of what's happening. Speed is critical. In security, 2 most important factors are speed and visibility. Do you understand what's happening in your environment? Have you seen indicators that an adversary is going to attack? Because if you don't have visibility into your assets, same thing in the physical world, if you don't know where your crown jewels are, where your key resources are, you can't protect them. You can't protect what you don't know about. And the adversaries are identifying this on a regular basis. If you can respond quickly enough, you can mitigate the consequences of an attack. Dwell time is the amount of time we see an adversary in an environment before they actually launch a malicious payload, or the amount of time it takes an adversary, once they get into an environment that might have 50,000 endpoints on it, to actually move somewhere in the environment where they can have significant impact. And that could be days or weeks. When I was in the FBI, my agents would go out regularly and knock on the door of companies and tell them, we know an adversary is in your environment. And they would say, no, they're not. And we'd say, here's your stuff. Is this yours? Because we saw it on this server en route to Russia. Is this your stuff? Yeah, it's our stuff. They go back, they do an evaluation. Oh, sure enough, the adversary's been there. Weeks, months, or years in many cases. So speed, being able to respond quickly, is going to help you. So what are the things you need to do? in order to have that speed proactively in advance using intelligence. I talked about information sharing. Nonsense. It's about intelligence, actionable intelligence. What do I know? All those questions I asked. Who's targeting us? Why are they targeting us? How are they targeting us? If you know, for example, that you're in your particular industry, that the Iranian government has targeted your competitor, it's likely they're targeting you because you've got similar technology, similar capabilities. I've seen companies that are completely competitive and would never share information about their emerging technology or their new products, but they absolutely will share threat information, because a rising tide raises all boats. So we compete in the market, so be it, but let's share intelligence so we make sure we stay as resilient as possible. The emerging capabilities of adversaries, they are not using known malware all the time. In fact, in the overwhelming majority of cases, they're using existing capabilities in the operating system to move throughout the environment to exfiltrate data, which makes them almost impossible to identify. So you can't, historically, using AV, antivirus, you search for known bad malware. Well, now what you've got to search for is known bad activity, or activity that will lead an adversary. We know what an adversary needs to do to accomplish their goals. If you can identify those tactics, you can identify them oftentimes. So you've got to proactively hunt in the environment. Again, same thing in the physical world, right? So you have the gates and the guards locked up, but once somebody passes the gates, if they're able to get past the gates and the guards, do you have anything, a security guard walking shifts, or a dog inside the building? Video cameras inside watching so you can see if somebody's penetrated your exterior. Same concept. How you respond to the challenge in the second half will determine what you become after the game, whether you're a winner or a loser. Loopholes. What does that mean? Well, we can prepare in advance, and we can do the best job we can, and at halftime, we're getting our butts whooped. So we need to change course. We need to adapt, right? This whole concept of flexibility. How do you do that? When something really bad happens and now there is an incident, how do you respond to that incident in your environment? Everyone has a plan till they get punched in the face. That's one of my favorites. The best plans go out the door. You don't, when the bomb goes off, you pull the binder off the shelf and blow off the dust and open it up, right? This is where that muscle memory comes into place. You have to be able to say that you've been preparing for this. This is where boards get involved. They want to make sure that they're getting the right information so they can make decisions. This is where the C-suite, the key leader, the leader who's got the responsibility, they're going to be asking these questions. They want to know. And you've got to be able to inform them. And this is where leadership comes in, crisis response. I've been in many crises in my life. Terrorist incidents, mass shootings, kidnappings, major cyber events, destructive attacks where companies have been shut down and all their hardware has been destroyed. And in all of these incidents I've been in, the separator, the differentiator is leadership. Who's in charge? How are they communicating? What's their strategy? Have they prepared, and are they able going forward to make the critical adaptations? Do they have the flexibility? Do they have the wherewithal? Do they have the sense of urgency? And when there's a real crisis in security, you better hope you've got the right leader, or you better be the leader that steps up and marshals the resources and gets people focused and gets their attention and gets them motivated. Because I can tell you, in all the situations I've been involved with where there's been a failure to respond, it's been a failure of leadership. So this is a key differentiator. And when people talk about cybersecurity, because I've watched hundreds of people talk about cybersecurity, I don't hear this word, but this is a word that factors in to our preparation, our execution, and our response. And if you're not in that position, if you don't have the right sense of leadership, you're doomed to fail. So I implore all of you as leaders to step up and have that sense. Human growth is at its greatest during times of trial and adversity and sacrifice and suffering. It enables us, it brings out the best of us. So I said Mike Tyson was my favorite. This is my favorite because this actually was one of my mentors, former Vietnam Marine, who was an instructor of mine at the FBI Academy, a great man who's now passed. But I can tell you that I've lived through this many times, and this is that leadership concept that when things break bad, if you've got good infrastructure in place and you've got plans in place and you've got the right leadership, you will come out of this, you will be stronger, you will have learned, and you will have helped your organization advance to the next level. And nobody wants to go through a crisis, but I can tell you that on the other end of a real crisis, there's a certain sense of appreciation for what you've been through, and a sense of accomplishment, and a sense of purpose. It used to be survival of the fittest. That's not valid anymore. Survival of the most adaptable. Are we able to change and grow as the adversaries change their tactics and techniques?
So Shawn, you were talking about the leadership and the right way to do this. Can you give us an example of somebody that has done this well? I mean, somebody that we've all heard of in the news, an organization that you say, you know what, they did it well and this is what they did.
There are a couple of organizations. I'll give you examples of ones that I've worked with that haven't come out in the news publicly. Companies that have done a couple things. First of all, when they've suffered a real tragedy, a catastrophe, they've actually been transparent about it, they've been truthful, and they've owned it. We made this mistake, this happened, and here's what we're doing to fix it. Now that's something that you've got to coordinate with outside counsel, inside counsel, you've got to coordinate with your PR folks, but where I've seen CEOs step up and say, this happened, and we own it, and we're taking it. I've also seen where there is, during a crisis, a sense of urgency, where the CEO, in particular, there was one particular incident, a major company that was hit with malware called NotPetya, which shut down their operations for weeks. And the CEO was fully engaged with all the employees, called all the employees together and said, here's what's happened. And unfortunately, we're going to have to cancel your leave if you have any leave scheduled, and we're going to have to cancel your weekend plans because we're going 24/7 to recover. And just that sense of rallying the troops and bringing everybody together and being on the floor physically talking to people, not at home, not sending emails, but physically being there and bringing in pizza to people or helping to rebuild the system. Just that presence, being in the moment is critically important. So there are a couple of situations where I've seen this happen, and conversely, the very opposite, where leadership is completely absent, they're not there, the employees are, they're listening to a mid-level manager, which in many cases that mid-level leader steps up and does what's right, but without the key leadership there, without them being engaged, people don't want to sacrifice. People are willing to sacrifice for something they believe in, and if the leader is standing there next to them, they will make personal sacrifice, and if the leader is absent and doesn't seem to care, they're not going to sacrifice. There will be people who will, but overwhelmingly, it's going to be a failure. So I think the most important piece is that sense of presence, of urgency, demonstrating that there's importance there.